Excluded and forgotten. How I revealed my parents' neglect. After their wedding? Without me. A lifetime of silence. For 25 years, I quietly endured being the forgotten child in my family. The silence wasn't just external, it became a part of me, embedded in my being. It was the silence that came from being overlooked and excluded, a silence that resonated in the background of my childhood and grew louder with each passing year. My parents, the people who were supposed to love, nurture, and care for me, somehow managed to miss those marks at nearly every turn. They never overtly mistreated me, never raised a hand or even a voice in anger, but that was almost worse. There was no grand event to point to, no singular act of cruelty, just a lifetime of being quietly sidelined and ignored. To the outside world, our family looked perfect. My parents were stable, responsible, and loving, at least to my siblings. They provided the basic necessities, of course, food, shelter, and education. But it was in the intangible things, love, attention, care, that I always felt the absence. I had an older brother, Luke, who could do no wrong in their eyes. He was the golden child, the one they celebrated and praised. Every achievement he made was met with pride and admiration, no matter how small. I still remember the time he won a local soccer match when he was 10, and my parents threw a backyard barbecue in his honor. I stood on the sidelines, helping my mom with the food, waiting for someone to say, "Great job on your report card." But that acknowledgement never came. Then there was my younger sister, Emma, who was their shining star. She had a charm about her that drew everyone in, including my parents. If Luke was the golden child, Emma was the darling. Even as a toddler, she had their full attention. Her every giggle met with smiles. Her every tear met with immediate comfort. As she grew, she became the center of their world. My parents attended all her dance recitals, always sitting front and center, beaming with pride. If she so much as sneezed, they were there with tissues, tea, and blankets, making sure she was comfortable. Meanwhile, I was a shadow, standing in the background, watching it all unfold. I was the middle child, the one who could do nothing right, even when I tried my hardest. My achievements were never celebrated. They were expected. When I came home with an A on my math test, my father barely glanced up from his newspaper. "That's good," he said, not even making eye contact. When I worked hard to make the school's debate team, something I had longed to be a part of, my mom shrugged it off as not a real sport. It was in these small, cutting moments that I began to realize my place in the family. Luke was their pride, Emma their joy, and I was just there. It wasn't always that I wanted attention or praise. Sometimes, I just wanted to be seen. I remember one Christmas when I was about 13. I had spent weeks saving up my allowance to buy thoughtful gifts for everyone in the family. For Luke, I found a vintage comic book I knew he'd love. For Emma, a bracelet she had admired in a store window. And for my parents, a picture frame where I placed a family photo from a rare trip we took to the beach. I was so proud when I handed them the carefully wrapped gifts, waiting for their reactions. But when they opened them, it was as if my efforts didn't matter. "Oh, how thoughtful," my mother said dismissively, setting the frame aside. Luke and Emma received their gifts with enthusiasm, but the moment passed too quickly and my gesture faded into the background. That was the Christmas I stopped trying to be noticed. As the years passed, I learned to silence the hurt. I convinced myself that maybe I just wasn't as special or as worthy of their affection. I poured my energy into excelling at school and work, hoping that maybe, just maybe, they'd notice. But they never did. Every family event, every gathering, every milestone seemed to revolve around Luke and Emma. Birthdays came and went with little acknowledgement of my existence, often overshadowed by my siblings' achievements or needs. I remember my 16th birthday vividly. I had been secretly hoping for a small celebration, something to mark what felt like a significant year. But when the day arrived, it was Emma's dance competition that took precedence. My parents spent the day preparing for her big moment, and by the time they returned home, they were too exhausted to even remember that it was my birthday. There were moments when I thought about confronting them, about asking why I was always forgotten, but I could never bring myself to do it. I feared that their response would hurt more than the neglect itself. What if they told me the truth? What if I really wasn't as special to them? It was easier, I told myself, to live with the uncertainty than to hear the confirmation of my worst fears. So I swallowed the pain, buried it deep, and carried on with my life. By the time I reached adulthood, I had accepted my role in the family. I was the dependable one, the quiet one, the one who never caused trouble. While Luke pursued his career in law and Emma danced her way through college, I found solace in my own path. I worked hard, built a career for myself, and tried to create a life that didn't revolve around my parents' approval. But no matter how much distance I put between us, the hurt remained. It was always there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for a moment to rise to the forefront. Then, after 25 years of being together, my parents made a surprising announcement. They had decided to finally get married. To most people, this might have seemed like a happy, exciting development, a long overdue celebration of love. But to me, it felt like a test, an opportunity to see if this would be the moment they'd finally recognize me as part of the family. I wanted to believe that this time would be different, that they would involve me in the process, that I'd finally be seen. The wedding planning began, and as expected, Luke and Emma were at the center of it all. They were included in every aspect of the preparation: dress fittings, venue choices, the guest list. My brother was asked to give a toast, and Emma was made the maid of honor. Meanwhile, I waited. I waited for the phone call, the invitation to join in, but it never came. Weeks passed and I heard nothing. I told myself to be patient, that maybe they were just busy, but deep down, I knew the truth. I had been forgotten once again. When the wedding date was announced, my heart sank. It was set for a weekend that I had already scheduled a work trip for, and my parents hadn't even thought to check with me before finalizing the plans. I debated whether or not to say anything, whether or not to ask if they had simply forgotten to include me. But the fear of rejection kept me silent. I figured I'd make it work. I'd rearrange my schedule and attend the wedding, even if they hadn't asked me to. But as the big day approached, it became clear that I wasn't part of their vision for the event. There were no calls, no invitations to help, nothing to indicate that I was expected to be there in any significant way. When I finally mustered the courage to confront my mother about it, her response was more hurtful than I could have imagined. "We didn't think you'd be interested," she said casually, as if my presence at my own parents' wedding was optional. When I pressed further, asking why I hadn't been included in the planning, she gave a half-hearted excuse about being overwhelmed and assuming I had my own life to worry about. It was in that moment that I realized the truth. I had been forgotten, not just for this wedding, but for my entire life. My place in the family had always been on the periphery, and no amount of effort on my part could change that. The day of the wedding arrived, and as I scrolled through social media, I saw the pictures flooding in. My parents, Luke, and Emma stood together, smiling, celebrating. It was a beautiful wedding, full of love and joy, everything I had wanted to be a part of, but had been excluded from. As I looked at the photos, I felt a familiar wave of hurt wash over me, but this time, something was different. This time, I was no longer willing to stay silent. The wedding that wasn't meant for me. As preparations for the wedding unfolded, it quickly became clear that this event, like everything else, wasn't about me. My parents excitedly involved my brother and sister in the planning, dress fittings, venue choices, even selecting the guest list. But I was conspicuously left out. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself that they would eventually reach out. But as the big day approached, I realized they had no intention of including me. When I confronted my mother, her response stung more than I could have ever anticipated. She said, "We didn't think you'd be interested." Interested? In the wedding of my own parents? I was baffled. When I pressed further, she gave a half-hearted excuse about being overwhelmed and assuming I had my own life to worry about. My father, as usual, stayed silent, offering no defense or apology. Then came the final blow. On the morning of the wedding, I checked my phone to see pictures and posts flooding social media. My parents' wedding in full swing without me. My brother and sister were standing proudly beside them, dressed to perfection, laughing and celebrating. There were smiles all around, and I wasn't even invited. That was when the years of silence and neglect finally caught up to me. The emotional floodgates opened, and I was no longer willing to sit by and pretend like it didn't hurt. I had been excluded from their wedding, the ultimate symbol of their love and unity, and I wasn't going to let it slide. Exposing the truth. Fueled by a mixture of hurt and anger, I did something I'd never done before. I shared my story. I went on social media and posted the truth for the world to see. I detailed years of neglect, being sidelined in favor of my siblings, and finally, the ultimate betrayal of being excluded from my parents' wedding. I wasn't vindictive or malicious. I simply told the truth, something I had never dared to do before. The post went viral in a way I hadn't expected. People reached out, offering words of comfort, sharing their own stories of family neglect and exclusion. My parents, of course, were furious. They called me, accusing me of airing private family matters in public. But for the first time in my life, I didn't care. I had spent years protecting their image, pretending everything was fine. Now, the truth was out, and there was no taking it back. What surprised me most was the response from my siblings. My sister was livid, calling me ungrateful and attention-seeking. But my brother, who had always seemed indifferent, quietly reached out. He admitted that he had noticed the way I was treated but didn't know how to address it. He apologized, and while it didn't erase the years of pain, it felt like a small step toward healing. As for my parents, they've yet to truly apologize. They claim they didn't mean to hurt me, that it was all a misunderstanding, but I know better. They may never acknowledge the full extent of their neglect, but that's no longer my burden to carry. I've learned to value myself in a way they never did. I've found strength in my vulnerability, and sharing my story was a step toward reclaiming my narrative. I may have been excluded from their wedding, but I'm no longer willing to be excluded from my own life.